the 14 News Podcast.
So, good morning, Paul. Welcome to the 14 News Podcast. And I'm really excited about this. I've got you on because you have released this book, The Phantoms of Christmas Past, and what an amazing cover it is. I absolutely love that. It really jumps out with the kind of lettering and the old picture, which I haven't seen before, that picture. So, really excited to talk to you. Do you want just to introduce yourself a little bit? Tell us kind of, I always like to go right from the very beginning of kind of your journey of life, of kind of getting into all this stuff, because I always find that really fascinating as well.
Yeah, I think probably like a lot of people my age, um, key touchstones were things like growing up and watching Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World and collecting the Unexplained magazine and all 13 volumes of them. And so that was the key touchstone. And then sort of discovering the local library had a section that they called The Mind, and that was where they kept all the books on ancient astronauts and the Bermuda Triangle and ghosts and monsters and all that kind of thing. So I was, always drawn to those. And then also it's just the area that I was brought up in, where I still live now, and that's the Calder Valley in West Yorkshire. That's sort of the area around Halifax, Hebden Bridge, and Todmorden. And Todmorden, as probably many of your listeners will know, is the place, the location of the UK's first supposed alien abduction. So I grew up with that as the background to my teenage years, and that sort of inspired my master's dissertation on the philosophy of religion and alien abduction. But so from there, I wrote a book called Weird Calderdale, Strange and Horrible Local History, that looked at alien abduction and ghosts and odd folklore and horrible murders in this area. And that sort of led to my interest in phantom attackers and social panics. And so I collaborated with a well-known expert on mass hysteria, Robert Bartholomew, and we sort of co-wrote a book on social panics.
Right.
But that sort of led almost directly to Phantoms of Christmas Past, that sort of mixes people's interest in ghosts and ghost lore with sort of hysterical panics when communities get gripped by this fear, and it sends them into all kinds of strange behavior.
Yeah, it is absolutely that, isn't it? I love it because it's this time of year is the time for ghost stories, but these are non-true ghost stories in a different way that's relating to history. And I put up a post actually recently and saying one of the most beautiful things, I tell ghost stories, as you know, and one of the most beautiful things is it links us to people in the past that aren't just kings and queens. They're these historical figures, and these really jump out in this book. So tell me a little bit about kind of the moral panic then, in terms of you doing that that writing and research on that, and relating to kind of the side of the paranormal, because that's something not really covered as much.
Yeah, there's a famous case known as the Halifax slasher case that happened in the West Yorkshire town of Halifax in 1938, when people believed that there was a razor blade wielding maniac haunting the streets, and lots of victims were coming forward with these, who said they'd been attacked at night by this mysterious stranger in a trilby hat and a long raincoat, and caused a sensation in the newspapers. And you got gangs of vigilantes roaming the street trying to catch the attacker, who was always too fast for them. And then it sort of spread from Halifax to Manchester to Glasgow, and almost every town in the country had this maniac slasher. But
Right.
when the police started to dig into the victims, one by one, they all confessed that they'd made up the story, they'd
Right.
injured themselves. And then the same thing happened all around the country. All the cases collapsed, and it turned out to be what we call a phantom attacker panic, where communities imagine this kind of attacker hiding in the shadows. And in some ways, the ghost panics in this book are very similar, except there's some kind of ghost involved. And that was, in the 19th century, way into the 20th century, it was a really common practice to throw a sheet over your head, or maybe a more elaborate disguise, and then hang around in a graveyard or a spooky lane, and then sort of prance around in a ghost-like manner, hoping that someone will see you, and you can scare the bejesus out of them. And that sort of led to similar kind of panics to the one we saw in Halifax, where gangs of um, vigilantes, armed with lead pipes or whatever, would patrol the streets trying to find the ghost. And if they did see someone who was acting suspicious with a white sheet, they'd often brain him or beat him up or chuck him in the nearest sewer or river or whatever. But yeah, so there is a sort of direct connection between these um, phantom attacker panics like the Halifax slasher and lots of others that people have researched over the years, and these strange ghost panics, which not many people have looked at. So there's very little in the academic literature about them, and I don't think there've been any popular books about them. So that's why it was really interesting for me to, because I was sort of thinking about a ghost story related book, but when you look at what's out there, there's millions of Christmas ghost story books, and I would say there's probably thousands
Oh,
of true ghost stories, in inverted commas, Christmas books. Um, but there aren't many that look at this strange phenomenon where people hoax ghosts and then all the strange fallout that happens afterwards.
yeah, I always have to giggle as well because thinking of I've only just got the book and I've started to read it, but the first one's the one that I have covered before because it's my original hometown, although I'm not far from you now, which is the Hammersmith ghost. And I did start to think if they did catch him and it was a ghost, what would they do? Because surely their batons would go straight through it.
You'd think so, and you also get quite a lot of cases where there's supposed poltergeist activity, and then you get huge crowds around the house. This is in the 19th century, waiting to see the ghosts, but it's not clear what exactly they'd see because poltergeists tend to chuck things around
Yeah,
rather than be a floaty, diaphanous spiritualist type ghost. So I often think that people wanted to gather around, and congregate around these areas where there's rumors of ghosts, not so much to see the ghost or because they believe in it, but they want to sort of share gossip with their neighbors, share their theories about what's happened, maybe share their own ghostly experiences. But quite often these meetings, I call them ghost flash mobs, that they'd hear about a ghost, they'd gather spontaneously, probably after the pubs had closed, and you get this sort of really riotous, drunken ghost hunts
right.
that would occur, and these were really common throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, especially at Christmas.
And why do you think it was at Christmas? Were more people drunk, or is it we kind of? I know we've gone away from it, although the Victorians moved a little bit more towards it. It's the whole Yuletide thing where the kind of the ghost experience is meant to be a bit more at the forefront, and the boundaries blurred a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's an element of both those things that Christmas, New Year, it's a sort of a liminal period where the border between the worlds blurs, and so
Mm,
interesting things happen. I think that's certainly part of it, and people love ghost stories, and so they might be more inclined to think about, investigate them. I think you're also right. I think people are more likely to be imbued with the Christmas spirit then as
yes,
well, so that might lead to them sort of wanting to celebrate in an unusual way. And also I think there was the fact that newspapers were looking for column inches and Christmas ghost stories, even if it was just some clown with a sheet over his head, always makes good copy. And so I think they were more likely to print the kind of news about these panics round about Christmas time, because they did happen all the year round, but
right.
frequently it started round about Halloween time as the nights grew longer, and then as the panic escalated, it would peak Christmas and New Year, and then fizzle out. So yeah, I think there are a lot of reasons why it tended to happen at Christmas.
And do you think culturally this is a very British thing, or do we see it all over the world?
I think it happens all over the world. I know that there's a professor, I can't remember his name, who's looked at similar panics in Australia. So
Right.
I think people have a a sense of mischief, and I think it would happen all over the world. But I suppose it's going to be rather different depending in the country. I suppose in Britain it tended to focus on ghost-like figures anyway, and I think that would be an interesting future study to look at how this similar phenomena represented itself in other countries. Yeah.
Yeah, the Brits do love a good ghost. I know in
Mm.
Germany they have like quite often a crazy boar or a giant bear or the big black dog that the everyone gathers to fight over history. But there are a lot of these stories about the UK. How was it? How hard was it to wade through like the folklore and get to the facts of these cases?
It's quite hard because quite often you'd be sort of looking at different sources because if you think about a newspaper archive, they might have just like a tiny little column that says some bloke is pretending to be a ghost in Derby or Dundee or whatever. Um, so it would you'd have to try and dig into that and try and find what happened before it, what's the ghost law connected to it, because often when people pretended to be a ghost, they would choose a place that had an existing folklore,
Right.
and then try and find the threads that led to what happened next, and was the person caught, and how did the village or the town react to it. So it required quite a lot of detective work to try and establish a string, a narrative from that went from the original ghost folklore to someone pretending to be a ghost to how the village reacted, and then how a panic developed, and then what happened next, and then all the little rabbit holes that leads to. And these stories, they do sort of lead down strange, unexpected rabbit holes, and the threads lead you in unexpected directions. So that's one of the thing that I thought was really interesting about
Mm.
these um, ghost hoaxes and ghost hunts is that they sort of mix people's love for the supernatural with true crime, with folklore, with bizarre hysterical panics, and all that kind of thing. So it makes a really strange kind of stew. And on top of that, you've got this sort of festive Christmas riotous ghost hunting mob that was sort of running wild in the streets at the same time.
Very different type of paranormal investigation to modern times.
Mm.
I've never brought a club with me yet, but we'll this time there is chance. Funnily enough, there was it 2 years ago? There was a guy that there was like headlines on social media. It just says man is arrested for making ghost noises in the graveyard and scaring people, and six people messaged and said, "James, is this you?" And for the record, it wasn't before anyone else asked.
But that's following in the direct tradition of what people were doing in the 19th century. Yeah, so it's interesting to know that people are still doing it. Maybe not to the same extent, but the
Yeah.
tradition survives.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Um, I do spend a lot of time in graveyards and looking for ghosts, but I haven't yet dressed up as one in one. But there's chance. Hopefully, it won't cause a riot afterwards.
You've got to be a fast runner if you do that.
I'm definitely not. Um, which which was your favourite to research, and which was the most difficult?
Um, well, it's hard to pick a favorite, but the clanking ghost of East Barnet was really interesting because that has quite a long history. So it started off with that there was already a East Barnet had a legend of the ghost of Sir Geoffrey de Mandeville, who was like a robber baron from medieval times who died in battle. And so his ghost, a typical ghost of an ancient baron who had clanking armor or clanking spurs, and that was his calling signal. People would supposedly hear his clanking, and that gave him his brilliant name, the Clanking Ghost of East Barnet. So, on top of this sort of ghost lore, in 1926, a watchman was guarding some building materials in Barnet, and he said he saw this strange figure appear in a red military cloak, and the body was a skeleton, so it was like a ghostly skeleton in a military cloak, and this appeared. It was widely reported in the newspapers, and it sort of led to this ghost hunt, impromptu ghost hunt with hundreds of people crowding into the streets of East Barnet, trying to find the ghost. Then by New Year of 1926, there were rumours that there was a grey lady who was trying to marry the ghost of East Barnet. So the
Wonderful.
clanking ghost of East Barnet. So she was supposedly so beautiful with aristocratic dimples that young men came from all over the country, all crowding into the narrow streets of East Barnet to try and catch these ghosts. And it became an annual thing. So every year, hundreds and then thousands of people would sort of descend on East Barnet trying to catch the ghost. And I suppose for me, the interesting thing is that they were unlikely to be sober. It was more likely to be like a Christmas celebration where people weren't that bothered about whether they were skeptics or believers or open-minded. They just wanted a Christmas celebration and they just wanted to run around the streets, some of them with pitchforks and things, just sort of hunting this ghost. But I suppose one interesting thing is you also got the psychic investigators who were coming down to try and they modeled themselves on the Society for Psychic Research. So they were trying to be methodical and scientific, and they were using telephones to communicate with each other and cameras and lights and everything. But against them, you had the London spiritualists who were coming down, and the Society for the New Barnet Research Society, the trying to be scientific. They never found anything, but the spiritualists would come down and because they were using mediums, they'd always claimed to have a ghost. And so there was this tension between them because the Research Society felt that, the spiritualists were coming from London and stealing their ghost. And then on top of that, you had these hordes of drunken ghost hunters running around the street and scaring each other for fun. And, and that they thought that was scaring the ghost away. So you had all these tensions that sort of reflected what was happening in the Society for Psychical Research because at the height of the clanking ghost of East Barnet's appeal, that was exactly the time when Arthur Conan Doyle led a mass resignation from the Society for Psychical Research because he felt they were being too skeptical towards spiritualist mediums. And so that was sort of reflected in this little microcosm. But the interesting thing for me about the clanking ghost of East Barnet, well, one was that the council got involved on a number of occasions. So the council debated whether night watchmen should get paid extra if they were guarding haunted locations, and also whether people who lived in a haunted location should get rates rebates. So there was all that kind of comic thing going on as well. But
that's amazing.
Every year it just got bigger and bigger, and it went on at least until the 40s, an annual sort of mass drunken ghost hunt on the streets of Barnet. Last one that I could find was 1945, when the streets were just blocked with thousands of cars coming down from London, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ghost of Sir Geoffrey de Mandeville, the clanking ghost.
That's absolutely incredible. I've never heard of this before. It's and quite a beautiful backdrop story of, these two people in death trying to find love and marry, and then just absolute chaos around it. It's a bit like when I put a story up on, and then the social media responses of people calling me mad, and then other people saying, well, no, they do exist, and all this, that, and the other, but just on a bigger scale and in person.
Yeah, and I guess because there was no social media then, the way people posted their comments was to go to the actual place and just tell and share it with the people that were there. And that's part of what we get with these strange ghost panics. There was in 1899 there was this bloke wrote a letter to an Islington newspaper saying he'd seen a ghost in the churchyard in Islington on Christmas Day in the evening. And so he said he was going there the next night to see it again. And so that was like an invitation to a ghost hunt. So you got hundreds of people crowded into this graveyard, all running riots, throwing things, jumping out on each other, making scary noises. The police completely lost control. And the police later suspected that the guy who wrote the letter was a pickpocket, and he'd done it deliberately to entice a lot of drunk people into a small area so that he could work his way through them and relieve them of their valuables. But this was really common. I found loads of these sort of drunken graveyard ghost hunting riots where hundreds or thousands of people would just go mad in this sort of celebratory, transgressive ghost hunt in a cemetery at night.
That's absolutely amazing that all these little stories could be a film in their own right. I mean,
Mm,
creating a plot to just get lots of drunk people in one place is just genius.
yeah.
And there's so many other stories that you could intertwine in these. So someone definitely needs to write a script.
Mm.
And the Hammersmith one changed the law, didn't it?
The Hammersmith one was, yeah, really interesting because that was 1803, 1804, Christmas 1803, and New Year 1804 was the peak. And again, you get this sort of a bit of ghost law background to it because it started when an Irishman called Thomas Flynn had tried to murder his wife and then took his own life. And to make an example of him, he was buried under a crossroads, and this caused, uproar in the local Irish community, because of the disrespect and that was afforded to him, even though it was obviously a nasty piece of work. But
Mm,
um, you've got this idea that this guy who had a guilty conscience, who was buried on unhallowed ground, is like an ideal candidate for someone who would be a ghost. And some people say people who took their own life were buried at crossroads because if the ghost came back, he'd be confused by the crossroads and wouldn't know which way to go on his
mm,
journey to haunt people. But so for that reason, when people started dressing up as ghosts in Hammersmith round about Christmas 1803, people's minds naturally turned to Thomas Flynn, because people were because he was an ideal candidate for a ghost. But it sort of spread with people panicking about this supposed ghost. There was one of my favorites was it happened on Christmas Day 1803. A coach driver was driving past a meadow. Hammersmith was quite rural in those days. It was
mm.
sort of on the border between London's growing conurbation and orchards and fields and so on, that supplied fruit and what have you to London. But this coach driver was driving past a meadow in the moonlight and he heard this eerie rattling noise. And when he looked out, he saw this ghostly figure all in white, but covered from head to foot, arms and legs and body with these rattling dried pig's bladders that were filled with dried peas. And, hard to understand, but that was a common children's toy at the time.
Right.
So you might, that was the PlayStation of the time,
Yeah.
a pig's bladder stuffed with dried peas. But, he got off and ran away and tried to bring help back, but they couldn't find any sight of the ghost. And there were rumors that a pregnant woman had been scared to death, which was a common trope in these panics.
Right.
This later turned out not to be true. But, the panic spread, patrol groups were formed, as is often the case. And then one guy called Francis Smith decided to take the law in his own hands, and he took a gun with him and he waited on a quiet country lane until a strange figure in white appeared and he challenged him. He said, who are you or what are you? Speak or I'll shoot. And when he didn't get a reply, he opened fire. And it turned out he killed a young plasterer called Thomas Millwood, who at the time plasterers wore white. That was their work costume, and he'd been mistaken for the ghost a number of times. So that again caused uproar in the community, and it's hard to sort of underestimate how the communities were gripped with these panics. It became feverish and febrile, and so thousands of people crowded into the pub where the inquest was held, trying to get a glimpse of the body. And then the guy who shot him, Francis Smith, he was sentenced to death the following Monday, but there was a lot of sympathy and he was reprieved. He was given a year in prison and got out after 7 months. But I suppose strangely, while he was in prison, a shoemaker called John Graham was arrested and charged with being the ghost because
Right.
he said that he had, he admitted that he dressed as a ghost in order to scare his apprentice because his apprentice had been telling his children ghost stories and now they couldn't sleep, so he wanted to get his own back. So he dressed as a ghost and scared the bejesus out of his apprentice. So it certainly worked. And so he got the reputation of being the Hammersmith ghost. He became a
Right.
scapegoat, really. And once a scapegoat is found, these panics tend to dissipate. Even 30 years later, this guy, John Graham, was still being called the Hammersmith ghost. he was arrested for being drunk and disorderly after intervening in a prostitute being arrested, and the newspapers were still calling him his ghost ship and the spiritual drunkard and all that. So he never lived it down. That's how much it sort of impinged on people's consciousness.
Yeah. And am I right in thinking there was also someone or some people dressed as ghosts sexually assaulting people in the graveyard as well in Hammersmith around about the same time, which also led to the uprising? Or have I got some cross
Well,
research there?
yeah, there was there was another Hammersmith panic a few years later in
Right.
the 1830s, the Hammersmith Monster, and some of those were a bit more violent, and they talked about the ghost having hooks and on his hands and that kind of thing. Now, what I what I think happens, a bit like the Halifax slasher case, is that when these panics begin, um, you might get one person dressing as a ghost, creating a bit of a rumpus. It appears in the newspaper, and then you get copycat behavior. So
Yeah.
other people do the same thing. They think it's allowed, and that's why the descriptions of ghosts are all very different. It's someone in white. They've got a devil mask. They've got glowing red eyes. They've got luminous paint and all that kind of thing. But also, what I think happens is that there's a small subset of people who, given the space, will invent things and then harvest the attention that they get. This is what we
Mm.
saw with the Halifax slasher. The victims cut
Yeah.
themselves um, and then made up an attack. And I think these ghost panics give space for people, maybe you might want to call it factitious disorder or something like that, but people who enjoy making stuff up, it gives them space to do that. So when these ghosts, these fake ghosts, get up to their shenanigans, typically they just prance around and strike ghost-like poses. And I think the ones where there are actual physical attacks, they're usually things like scratches. Um, I think those are the ones that we should be suspicious of,
Right.
that this might be the case where the victim is sort of copying what they've heard in the newspapers and um, getting a bit of attention, maybe getting a day off work, becoming a celebrity victim.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think all these things work together to make these panics really not just complex, but really an interesting stew of all kinds of psychological and social mechanisms.
'Cause there was a one in London, wasn't there, where it was alleged that a gentleman was stabbing ladies in the bottom with a fork. And a lot of those were said to be, because that was going viral in those times. If you made it in the local newspaper, then you were, like you said, a celebrity briefly.
Yeah, are you talking about the London Monster
Yes, yeah,
there?
yeah,
Yeah, so this was, yeah, in Georgian times, the London Monster, um, some accounts he sort of jabbed women in the buttocks or the thigh with a knife or with metal claws or with syringes yeah, and that led to a huge panic. 1788, I think, something like that. Anyway, but in Georgian times, that led to a huge panic, and it's I don't know. It led to a huge campaign. There were poster campaigns, and that's a really, because I wrote about it in my book with Robert Bartholomew on social panics, and yeah, somebody eventually got arrested from it. It was called Rennick Williams. He was an artificial flower maker, and it seemed a bit unfair because he was a pretty seedy guy, but he obviously wasn't the monster because there'd been so many attacks. He had a pretty good witness. He was working on the night of some of the main attacks, and he had loads of witnesses that said he was. Descriptions of the monster were very difficult, but he became the London Monster, and he was in prison for it. I think he spent several years, 7 or 8 years in prison. But yeah, that was a really interesting one because if you were attacked by the monster, it meant that you were a woman of exceeding beauty.
right.
So that sort of gave a little bit of an incentive. There was one woman uh, who was found to have faked her attack, and she became a celebrity victim, and hundreds of young men would come to her father's fruit shop to get a glimpse of this beautiful young victim, and she would show these young men the bits of the delicate parts of her anatomy that had been wounded by the London monster. So the London monster is a strange one because of the sort of titillation. If your listeners aren't familiar with it, looking up the prints that were the contemporary prints at the time, they're hilarious. It's a bit like an 18th century Carry On film.
Yeah, yeah. And I'd love to know your views on the Spring Heel Jack as well. I know it's slightly off topic of this, but it's similar in a way as well.
Yeah, I think Spring Heel Jack fits exactly into this tradition of playing the ghost, because the earliest accounts of Spring Heel Jack, which was sort of in the 1830s, we think of Spring Heel Jack as having springs on his heels and this sort of devilish mask and fire breathing and then bouncing around on his springs. But the earliest accounts describe him as being dressed like a bear or dressed like a wild animal or a demon. And it was only a bit later that that it sort of came together to create this sort of the figure that we know as Spring Heel Jack. So it started off as a very typical playing the ghost type of thing where someone in a strange costume was scaring people. And that sort of, like you said, it went viral. There were a couple of high profile cases where he supposedly vomited fire into a woman's face or scratched them with their claws and then bounced away over the rooftops. I mean, the thing to be skeptical about with Spring Heel Jack is, first, although fire breathing is possible, they do it in circuses. Doing it outdoors as an amateur, you're asking to set your face on fire. And secondly, bouncing with springs, although it sounds fun, if you've ever had a go on a pogo stick, it's a recipe for a broken leg. So it's not possible to bounce around on springs like you're Zebedee or someone. I think some of the most famous high-profile cases about Spring Heel Jack were invented by a researcher called Peter Haining, who is well known for editing ghost books, but he wrote a well-known book on Spring Heel Jack, probably in the 70s and 80s, and some of his best stories, no one can find any trace of them in the contemporary newspapers. So some of those seem to have been made up. But yeah, Spring Heel Jack was, it had elements of the social panic, the phantom attacker, but it also had elements of people dressing as ghosts. And then it just seemed to have taken on a mythology of its own, because it wasn't long before Spring Heel Jack became a superhero.
Right.
He was, comic books were written, not comic books, Penny Dreadfuls were written about him, where he was an aristocrat who'd been diddled out of his fortune, and so he took on this costume with the devil mask and the bouncy springs, and he went bouncing around righting wrongs and that kind of thing. So he became like a superhero.
Yeah, and there's stories of the aristocracy who were paying people to do inventions and trying to outdo each other as kind of this strange bet as well, going around and all these strange rumors and.
Yeah, there was that. There was a common trope that not just with Spring Heel Jack, definitely with Spring Heel Jack, but with a lot of the other ghost panics, people assumed a lot. There was like a folk theory that at the bottom of it were a group of aristocrats who were having these wagers about how many people they could scare to death, and they would have point systems. So, a few points for a little boy, but get more points for a pregnant woman, or so many points for an old lady. So they were having a competition about how many people they could scare to death. Now, when people had actually been caught red-handed from playing the ghost or with a sheet over their head, it tended to be a bloke from the next village or a shoemaker down the road. So it tended not to be the aristocrats that people thought. It tended to be people from their own community who were up to the mischief.
Well, there's a real. I always think it's interesting because if we look at a lot of places, and when I get a call to investigate somewhere because they've got poltergeist activity, it's normally a just a usual house, but we don't drive along a street and go, oh, this street will be haunted. We go to the big manor house and say, this is what must be haunted. And all the ghost stories are often tied in with the aristocracy. It's a really interesting thing because probably they've had less trauma and less people die than they have in a common area.
You think so? I suppose it's yeah, and I guess maybe it's the sort of the idea of set and setting. We just expect ghost stories to happen in an
Mm,
appropriate environment, and if it's a graveyard or a crumbling ancient mansion, it just feels more ripe for having a ghostly history than a 20th century red brick house or
yeah.
or a car park or a local supermarket or something.
And I suppose people write what they know, and most of the writers would have been of the upper classes anyway, and so probably
Mm.
living in these big houses. I was in Glasgow 2 weeks ago, and there was one there, wasn't there, in the graveyard, the necropolis. The is it Goebbels vampire? Do you know that one? What was
Okay, no,
that?
what's that one? I've
So
heard of that.
it
Yeah.
was in the 50s, I think, and it was some children saw a vampire with 7 foot tall with steel teeth. And then all the kids in it, because it made me laugh, they were all out the next night with forks trying to fend off this 7 foot vampire with just a group of kids. I just thought it was really an amusing
That's
one.
right. Yeah, because there was a similar thing in 1897 in Woolwich where, but this had somebody playing a ghost. Was appearing next to a school, and so you got hundreds of school kids coming down at night, armed with stones to pelt the ghost. And of course, they couldn't stop themselves from putting through the windows of the school while they were at it. But the talk about the vampire in Glasgow, it reminds me of the Highgate vampire because in the 60s, something very similar happened
Right.
then. That there were rumors that there was strange goings on and black magic rituals or whatever happening in Highgate Cemetery, where Karl Marx is buried, and that there was a vampire there, and it led to this huge occult feud between vampire hunters and so on. But I heard something really, what I thought was really funny, and it does have a Christmas connection. And someone told me that in the late 1960s, the Birmingham musician Roy Wood
Yeah.
from The Move and Wizard, I Wish It Could Be Christmas Every Day, he'd just finished a gig and he went to a pub near Highgate, and they were having a drink, and they were talking about the state of the world, and they decided to put the world to rights by going into Highgate, lighting some candles and raising the spirit of Karl Marx. So they did that, just larking around and pretending to
Yeah.
do some kind of occult ritual. And it so the person who told me this story said that he thinks that that's what started it. That's what
Right.
started attracting crowds to Highgate after they'd seen these strange activities going on, and that sort of ran out of control. Because I think the Highgate vampire case was a fairly modern iteration of the graveyard ghost panic
Mm.
that I've written about in the book.
The singer out of The Damned as well was once drunk and coming from a gig or something and kind of lurched into the road in front of a car outside a church. And then he said in the news the next day there was a story that said vampire seen in the cemetery. So there's obviously like a grain of truth where these stories come from, isn't there?
There is, yeah.
Which do you think is the one that maybe started with them seeing something paranormal the most? Like genuinely paranormal?
Well, it's hard to say with these. I mean, you could argue that because the focus of the book was hoaxes.
Yeah,
So for most of them, most of the stories I've gone for um, cases that were clearly hoaxes.
yeah,
Um, because looking at the kind of Christmas books that were out there of supposedly true ghost stories, there were quite a lot of them, and
yeah,
I thought I wanted to try and find a different approach. So um, looking at them, I mean, the clanking ghost of East Barnet that we talked about, the early some of the earlier accounts were maybe not hoaxes. Although the night watchman who saw the ghost, he later denied everything, and so
right.
it's hard to tell. So I think with most of these ghosts, the ghosts that I write about, there may be some ambiguity with them. And there might be enough ambiguity for some people to say there's room left there for there to be some kind of real ghostly activity. But there's also plenty of reason for skeptics to say that this was a hoax that sort of got out
Mm,
of control.
yeah. And when did these kind of die out as being so common? What sort of era?
They there were quite a few in the early 20th century. In the 1920s, that seems to be when they died out. I mean, the clunking ghost of East Barnet was unusual in that it
Mm,
kept going right until the 40s, till 1945. After that, it became more episodic, and maybe the although things like graveyard shenanigans, like you talked about in Glasgow and Highgate, happened occasionally. Um, it's it seemed to die out. It just wasn't as regular, and it might be because you got increased ease of communication. People could, you know, get their news in other ways. They didn't have to descend on the location.
mm.
Because I think what drove these panics is that, when they'd hear rumors of a ghost, they would descend on the location at night, possibly after the pub, and that sort of created this atmosphere where people would go on these celebratory, um, transgressive, drunken ghost hunts.
I suppose there's more entertainment now as well. So you might go out, but there might be something on TV you want to see instead.
There's more to do now. Yeah, you don't have to stand outside in a freezing graveyard on a winter's night
Yeah,
if
I
you
still
want a bit
do,
of fun.
but that's still my idea of fun. But I am few and far between. I have had people run off when they see me just stood in the darkness. They must assume that I am something. Someone just came actually. It was only a couple of weeks ago, and I walk my dog every night in the Dean Road Cemetery, and they're walking up, and I don't walk with a torch. My eyes are quite accustomed to the dark, and I even walk around my house in the dark. And they just saw me and then just turned straight back round and walked off. But um, there might be a
Yeah,
rumor
I hope they
starting.
didn't sort of report a vampire or something
Yes,
hanging
you never
around.
know. You never know. Um, where do you think this is going to take you? Are there any kind of more out there in terms of your research of these cases?
Oh, there are hundreds of these cases. I selected a few that were sort of that happened round about Christmas, and that I could tease out a kind of origin and a development, and a kind of and then that had a sense of an ending, that had a sense of a complete story. Um, but there are hundreds of these. They happened all year round. I've recorded a few on my website, but I think it's an untapped seam of really interesting Fortean stories because, as I said before, as well as the sort of ghost lore at the time, you also get this psychological and sociological phenomenon of mass panics and art gangs of vigilantes, and then you get the psychic investigators coming in, and they're arguing with the spiritualists who are coming in, and then you've got the massive ghost hunters who are just turning up for a drunken party in the graveyard at night to all creating this complex brew.
They've definitely got a really strong narrative to them. I'm just looking up an author's name while I'm talking to you. So, just from where you live, you spoke about Calderdale. Um, Andrew Michael Hurley,
Mm.
the author who did The Lonely and Devil's Day, he lives in that area, and what he does is he gets a map and basically looks at names, and that gives him ideas. And he found there's loads of places in your area called like Devil's Rock or all these, and there's just seems to be loads of folklore. Did you find kind of like some really interesting different stories to there?
Yeah, quite interestingly, unfortunately, I can't remember the name of the author. I read a book recently. Was it called The Devil's Land or Devil Land or something like that? But he looked at the use of the devil in place names in England, and he found that actually they were quite often pretty recent and
Right,
connected with tourism,
right.
and that previous to that, the rock that was called Devil's Rock, or the bridge that was called Devil's Bridge. Uh, Before that, they'd been named after local giants, or something
Right.
like that, and that as tourists started to come and travel in areas, and tour guides needed a story to tell, that's often when the local rock or hill or whatever was given the name of Devil's Hill or Devil's Rock or Devil's River and everything. So that was quite interesting. I mean, the places around here, we've got quite a few Robin Hood. You got a Robin Hood's Pennystone, another Robin Hood's Bed on the moors. So you got all of these just down from where I live now, just over on the moors. There's a nice standing stone called Churn Milk Joan that was supposed to be where a young maid sold her soul to the devil in order to
Right.
save her sick parents' lives. And that became a subject of a poem by Ted Hughes, although in his version, improbably the girl gets eaten by a fox, killed and eaten by a fox. But I don't know how many people are killed and eaten by foxes these days, but that's what Ted Hughes did in his poem. So, and there's lots of folklore about this stone that New Year's Eve it turns round 3 times. I've been
Right.
One day I'm going to go up there on the
Yeah.
moors New Year's Eve and just film it at midnight and see and get proof or not that it turns round.
Yeah. We've got one in one of our graveyards, St. Mary's, that on I think it's St. Mark's Day. On the eve, everyone there's a procession of the dead who come out of the church at midnight, but it's not the dead, it is people of the town that are going to die that year. And the folklore is two ladies came to witness it, and one of them saw themselves in the parade, and of course then had a heart attack, got fright and died. And lovely,
Wow.
lovely story. But I have been twice now and never
You haven't
witnessed it.
seen it.
No.
Well, it's probably for the best that you haven't seen
Yes.
it.
I hope I wouldn't see myself in it. I don't know what I'd do if I did. But I love these stories and places, just the folklore and how they're carried on and changed, and some of the really unique ones that are totally different. And of course, we've got ancient in Yorkshire, these ancient, like you said, the stones and the folklore that seems to still draw high strangeness, whether it's UFOs, stories of werewolves, phantoms, all these things. We definitely have a hotbed of it here, don't we?
Certainly do, yeah. And it sort of really influenced me, I think, growing up in the Calder Valley, where
Mm,
we've got from Halifax, the Halifax slasher, sort of mass hysteria, and then Todmorden UFOs, the first supposedly first UFO abduction in the UK.
mm,
The other interesting thing that I grew up as a background was a case of a Manchester witch called Barbara Brandolani tried to buy a disused chapel on the moors above Hebden Bridge to turn it into a witch's coven, and it created this huge hoo-ha. And media team. This was in the 80s. Media teams from around the world sort of descended on this little village, and she was in all the newspapers, and there was a great deal of opposition. And then she claimed that she'd turned into a Black Panther and was roaming the moors and killing sheep. And then, just when it couldn't get any weirder, Cliff Richard comes in and puts up the money to buy the chapel and stop the witch from buying it. So you've got these really surreal, interesting sort of modern things, as well as the sort of ancient stones and legends of devils and boggarts and all that kind of thing.
that's another film right there. The
Yeah,
story
that's
about
absolutely.
Cliff Richard saved a church from a
Yeah.
witch. That's incredible. And yeah, boggarts. We've got. It's surprising how many places are named after like boggles and boggarts. We've got Boggle Hole just up the
Mm.
road, and I always tell the story that I was doing a video and mocking the boggle, saying what load of nonsense it is, and just as I said it, total coincidence, but just as I said it, a rock fell from the cave roof right on my hand, and I thought I'd broken my hand, so I didn't mock it any longer after that. But we are kind of entrenched in this deep mythology and belief, isn't it, that still exists of the Fae as well
Mm.
in this area.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess we sort of assume that seeing is believing, but on the other hand, it's also the case that believing is seeing, because the way we look at the world is influenced by how we were brought up and what we think and what we believe, and that's how we interpret it. And in the case of playing the ghost, when people would hang out in graveyards with a sheet over their heads or cover themselves with luminous paint, if you're walking down a dark alley and you see this sort of luminous figure, you're in the right sort of setting to think, is this a ghost? Is this some idiot dressed as a ghost? It probably doesn't matter. It could be a
Yeah.
maniac, whichever way you're going to be feeling pretty scared, because it's going to touch all the touch points
Mm.
that trigger your fear of the undead, the supernatural, and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, and then your heightens are at that extra sensitive thing, so then you interpret things differently as well, don't you?
You do. You interpret it differently, and then when you tell people about it, perhaps you sort of add a little bit of color to it, and they add a
Yeah.
little bit of color to it, and so there was one interesting one that's not in the Christmas book. It's in Weird Calderdale, but in I think it's in the 1860s in Todmorden. Um, the story spread that the station master was on the platform, and he saw this white wraith-like figure with glowing red eyes approaching him on the platform. And at first he thought, it was a ghost from someone who died in a train crash, who was coming to tell him that the 1234 had gone off the rails and everyone was dead. And so he thought it was a ghost. And then the ghost vanished, but so did the station master. And so you got crowds of people coming down to the station the next day and the following day, hundreds and thousands of people desperate to know what had happened.
Yeah.
What was this ghost, this red-eyed figure, and what had happened to the station master? And then the station master, 2 days later, rocks up for work, sees these hundreds of people gathered round, thinking that he'd disappeared. And he explained what had happened. He said he was on the platform and he saw this white figure with the red eyes, and he did think maybe it was a ghost. But then he saw it was an escaped ferret. Um, and he told his mates, and his mates had told their mates, and suddenly the ghost became this red, the ferret became a red-eyed ghost, and the station master had been dragged off to hell and all that kind of thing. So it just showed, and this was in a couple of days, how fast these stories can change and develop as
That's
people just add a
amazing.
little bit of extra color when they tell it to the next person.
That's absolutely brilliant. That's made me giggle. But the reverse also happens as well. So, which I find interesting. They call it the what is it? Paranormal apathy. So, and I was once with a friend, and he'd come to pick me up at my house, and my house was Roman on a Roman road, and then it was a medieval house and very old, and it was just a residual ghost. We walked out, and we just saw this layer of I suppose it would be like fog, you'd call it, just on the floor, which just kind of swelled up into form this woman, just strode right in front of us and then hit the wall and fizzled out. And it was as clear as day, translucent, but like the films, like just literally a figure, but made of mist. And then he was so scared he wouldn't come near the house again. But then you talk as the years go by, you go, well, I thought I saw that. It's like you were definitely sure enough to never approach the house again. And that night we definitely spoke about it, and my mum had seen it as well. But she thought she'd gone mad, so she was like really relieved. So there's this strange thing where people do experience things and then underplay it as well. Maybe they're not ready to have that acceptance.
Maybe it makes it all quite complex, but it's also what makes it interesting, and it's sort of these ambiguities that these are the places we should look, in those ambiguities, because that's where the sort of interesting stuff
Yeah.
is happening.
Do we get many of these stories in Ireland? Because they're out of any people in the world, I guess they're the ones that do love to kind of spin a yarn and make it really an interesting story where you can go to the shop and buy a bottle of milk, and by the time it's gone round the pub, you've bought an entire cow and milked it yourself, and then it's jumped over the moon.
Yeah, I would bet there are. I was focusing on England. There's one from Scotland as well in Phantoms of Christmas Past. Um, I think that there's certainly a similar book to be written about Ireland. I mean, I did come across a few similar poltergeist type cases where quite often you'd get because to fake a ghost, it tended to be a male thing, to because you'd be out at night on your own, prancing around a graveyard with a sheet over your head. Because of women's social roles, they were often confined to the home a lot of the times in the 19th,
Mm.
20th century, and you would get quite a lot of cases where servant girls and maids would get up to mischief, maybe as a kind of little protest, or
Yeah.
by throwing things around and knocking things over, and then looking all innocent and demure. So there was one in Clonmel in Ireland, which is where my mum's from. I gave the ghost the name of Sweary Mary because it was shouting and swearing obscenities when people couldn't see where the voice was coming from. I think in the end it was decided that the maid was responsible, and this was really common. I guess it was they were letting off steam. There might be young girls who've been taken from their home when they're 15 or something, and then plonked and doing this menial work in in a posh house a long way from home, and it might have been an act of rebellion and so on. But yeah, these cases were quite common and quite comical in a lot of ways. I called it poltergeist Cluedo, trying to work out who it was who was responsible for throwing things across the room when no one was looking.
Fantastic. We're almost up to an hour. And before we uh, tell people where to get the book, etc., what are you working on now?
Strangely enough, I'm working on a history of demonic possession in Lancashire. Um, so, sort of from 1600 to 1700, there were disproportionately a lot of demonic possession cases in Lancashire.
Right.
So it was like a battleground between the Catholics and the Puritans, both of whom weaponized demonic possession and exorcism as a tool to prove that they were the one true religion. And of course, in the middle of that, you had the Anglican Church, the Church of England, who were dismissive and saw the Catholics and the Puritans as crazy extremists who were
Yeah.
whipping up this superstitious supernatural beliefs. So you get these really bizarre demonic possession narratives. So I've been, I'm not far from finishing that. Maybe it will be out at the end of this year if I'm fast.
Oh, you'll have to come on and talk about that as well. That sounds
Love
really,
to.
really fascinating. And you're in a folk band as well, I gather.
Um, I played in a folk rock band called the Ukrainians for about 27 years. I left last
Right,
year.
you've
I
left.
hung up the mandolin last year to focus more on
All
writing. But
right.
yeah, I've been a musician and played in bands for longer than I care to remember.
I'll have to check them out. So, Paul, where can this is the book for I'm going to hold it up to the camera so people could see with that brilliant cartoon there and that amazing lettering. Where can people get the book and find out more about what you're doing?
So the book's available wherever you get your books from. If you want it by Christmas, you're probably going to have to go mail order, but you know the place where you can get it from
Yeah,
online. So any online bookshop will have it. Um, I've got a blog at paulweatherhead.com. So I write mostly about weird history, ghost hoaxes, a bit like the ones in Phantoms of Christmas Past, but also strange folklore, mass panics, and that kind of thing. I've got
wonderful.
a bit of a podcast, which is mainly audio versions of blog articles, and that's Monsters, Myths, and Manias. You can
Brilliant.
get that wherever you get your podcast from.
Fantastic. I'll include the links in the show notes so people can check those out. And thank you so much for coming on and I hope you have a very happy Christmas.
Same to you. Thanks for having me, James.
Thank you.